Well, good morning. Last week we covered two stories. Well, we finished with two stories about the value of its soul. When the shepherd lost one sheep, he went and found his lost sheep and then celebrated. And the second story was about a woman who lost a silver coin, and she celebrated when she found it. The third story in Luke 15 is about a man with two sons. Now, most, but not all sermons focus on the prodigal son. That's what this story is called. But pay attention to the attitudes of both sons. Which one actually humbles himself? Which one acted like a petulant child? Hint, both of them actually, but let's pay attention to that, and pay attention also to the father's attitude, not just towards his lost and found son, but to his other son also. And then finally, I will also take a moment to talk about one of the servants and see if we can't learn a lesson there as well. So Luke 15 verses I'm going to start reading in verse 11, and I'm going to break it up a little bit. Jesus shared another story. There was a man with two sons. His younger son told his father he wanted his share of the estate. So the man divided his estate between his two sons. Now remember that in agrarian societies, the oldest son typically inherits all of the land and the majority of the estate. So this younger son would not receive half of his father's estate. He would receive a portion. Verse 13, shortly after that, the younger son took everything he had and went to a distant country. There he spent all of his money in living a wild life. After he was broke, a severe famine occurred in that whole country, and he was desperate for what he needed to live. So he took a job with a farmer in that country. His job was to feed pigs. He was so hungry that he wanted to eat the pigs' food. But nobody was giving him any food. Now, evidently, the farmer that hired this youngest son owned a very large herd of pigs. Otherwise, he would not have needed one man just to feed his pigs. But can you imagine how hungry he was? I mean, just how hungry do you have to be to want to eat what pigs would typically eat? I mean, typically it's waste food, or leftovers from the people's food, grain, raw corn, raw grain. Pig food is often called slop. He was considering eating what would have clearly been rather disgusting. In verse 17, Jesus continues, one day the younger son realized that his father's servants had more than enough food while he was starving almost to the point of death. He decided to return to his father and admit his sins against God and his father. He would tell him he was no longer worthy to be called his son, but just wanted to be one of his father's servants. Now, how hard is it to admit you are wrong? Frankly, most of us are not willing to do that. Not until we have no option. That's sort of human nature. Do you know what I mean? But perhaps your story is not the same as this one. This is a rather extreme incident. But if we are honest, most of us have made a mistake and been unwilling to admit what we had done was wrong. This man was so humbled, so desperate, he was willing to not only apologize, but he was willing to beg to be just a servant to his father, also that he could eat. Oh, but as we continue, we'll find it's not enough to realize you were wrong. You need to do something about that. So in verse 21, so he left that country and went to his father. Before he was even close to his father saw him and was overcome with compassion and ran to his son. When he reached his son, he hugged him and kissed him. The son told his father he had sinned against God and him, and that he was no longer worthy to be called his son. Oh. So let's watch what happens when somebody humbles themselves and follows through, sincerely apologizing. I mean, well, let's read it and then I'll talk about it. Verse 22, the father told his servants to bring his best robe and put it on his son. Then he put a ring on his finger and he put sandals on his feet. Then he told his servants to bring a fattened calf and kill it so they could have a feast and celebrate. He said, my son was as good as dead and has returned to me alive. He was lost and now is found. They all started to celebrate. Now, give the young man credit. His father ran to him, welcoming him. It would have been easy for him to not bother apologizing. But he still apologized. And notice how his father welcomed him. He gave him his own best robe. No doubt his son was wearing dirty clothing, torn, whatever. He gave him a ring. And rings on wealthy people were often quite valuable. They could be used like getaway money or emergency money. Then he gave him sandals. It doesn't say better sandals. It didn't like best robe. It doesn't say better sandals. It appears that this son had sold his own sandals. He's probably barefoot. I mean, sandals do wear out, So he had his servants bring a fattened calf. We're talking veal steaks here. Be good time. Time for a party. Everyone joined in the celebration. The father's excitement must have been quite contagious. However, in verse 25 we read, when the older son who was in the field returned home, he heard music and dancing. He asked one of the servants what was happening. The servant told him that his brother had come home and his father had the fattened calf killed because his son came home safe and sound. Now imagine this scene. The oldest son and a servant. Now consider what the servant would have been thinking. Do you think he was excited about his master's youngest son returning? I mean, the previous paragraph said everyone was celebrating. What would he think when his master's oldest son responded with bitterness? Do you ever think about that servant and what he was seeing? Youngest son comes home, daddy's excited. Oldest son comes home, he's very bitter and angry. Do you think the servant went back to enjoy the party, or do you think he stayed and said, oh, poor you work so hard? No, I think the servant probably went back to the party. Who wants to hang around and go, woo, when you can party, right? All right, so verse 28, and I'll read through 30. Hearing this, the older brother became angry and refused to go into the house. His father came out and pleaded with him. He told his father, listen to me. All these years I worked hard for you, and I never once disobeyed you. However, you have never even given me a goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when your son that wasted all your money on prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. Wow. Let's see. Do you think the servant that told the oldest son about the celebration went straight to his master to let him know the older son's attitude? Well, probably. Especially if he actually cared for the family. It seems to me that his father would have generated loyalty and devotion from his servants. Do you know what I'm saying? That seems to be the type of person he was. Also, did you notice in there that the oldest son said, he wasted all your money on prostitutes? Now, how does he know that? If the youngest son went to a faraway land and now he's home. How's the oldest son know what he was doing there, spending his money on prostitutes? I mean, it's probably a pretty good assumption, but I don't know. Just something to think about. Did you? So anyway, so the father went out to his oldest son. He didn't send for him. He didn't go to chastise. He went to try and help his son understand everything. He listened to his oldest son complain about all he had done. The father could have probably responded, "You worked hard because you want to inherit everything, not because you cared about me. Just look at your attitude now." But he did not do that. The father welcomed his lost son, but he cared about his oldest son too. He didn't try and beat down the youngest son because he had done wrong. He didn't try and beat down the oldest son because he had a bad attitude. He just tried to gently persuade them. In verse 31, his father said, "My son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours." Remember, it had been split. His father continued, "We had to celebrate and rejoice because your brother was dead and is alive again. He was lost but has been found." Well, those three parables in Luke 15 teach one lesson. Like the father in the last parable, and we saw it in the first two, each soul is important to God. All right, let's continue in Luke 16. Notice that in this chapter, Jesus is speaking to his disciples. Sometimes that changes how Jesus shares and or explains his parables. Have you noticed that? In the previous chapter, Jesus was teaching Pharisees and experts in the law just how important people are to God. So what is he teaching his disciples in this chapter? Pay attention. Jesus is going to share two parables, and they both have the same lesson. Typically, these parables are taught individually, but if we add them together, they seem to become more significant, or you get the emphasis more. I'm going to read each parable individually. I'll talk about each as I complete that one. So Luke 16, verses 1 through 9. Jesus told his disciples about a wealthy man whose manager was embezzling funds. He confronted him and asked about what he had heard. He told him to give him all the paperwork because he was fired. The manager knew he couldn't do manual labor, and he knew he was too proud to beg, so he came up with a plan that would make sure people would let him live with them. He called in each of the people who owed the wealthy man. He asked the first man how much he owed his master. The man said, 800 gallons of olive oil. The manager told him to make out a new bill and write down that he owed 400 gallons. He asked the second man how much he owed his master. The man said he owed 1,000 bushels of wheat. The manager told him to make out a new bill and write down that he owed 800 bushels. When the wealthy man learned about what his manager had done, he was impressed. Worldly people are quite clever in dealing with other worldly people. Jesus is speaking, remember. People of the light are not clever in that respect. I'm telling you to use your worldly wealth to make friends, then you will be welcomed into your eternal home. Before I continue with the lesson, I'm just thinking, the Bible doesn't tell us if the wealthy man gave the manager his job back. It doesn't tell us what the wealthy man did in response to what the manager did. That's not important, but it's something a serious Bible student would notice. I mean, did the wealthy man give the manager his job back? Probably not. Because he stole, and then he stole some more. Did he retaliate? Did he take him to court? We aren't told. That's not the point of this. What lesson was Jesus teaching his disciples? Do you understand? This is a parable that is not taught very often. And why? Because preachers don't want to cheat. That is not the point of this parable. Jesus isn't saying you need to cheat. The lesson is given in verse 9, where Jesus says, I am telling you to use your worldly wealth to make friends. Then you will be welcomed into your eternal home. The lesson? Use your worldly wealth to help win souls for God's kingdom. Now that isn't going to happen if you, like many Christians say, I have nothing to do with non-believers. Jesus came, like he said in Luke 19:12, the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. Jesus ate with the wrong people. His disciples were the wrong people. If we only want to hang around with believers, how are we going to win anybody for Christ? Go into all the world, well, but only visit with true believers. No. Go into all the world and preach the good news. Jesus taught this lesson several times. Look back at Luke 12:33 and 34, where he said, sell your possessions, give it to the poor. This will give you riches in heaven, where riches cannot be destroyed or stolen. Where your treasure is, that is where your heart will be also. Mark 10:21 says almost the same thing. Sell everything you have and give all the money to the poor. Then you will have treasure in heaven. Jesus just said that he expects his disciples to be wise in using wealth. Keep that in mind as we continue. And remember, Jesus is still teaching his disciples. Verse 10. And I'm going to actually break this parable up. Verse 10. I can't help it when I look at the first paragraph, 10 through 12. Someone that can be trusted with little things can also be trusted with much more. Someone that is dishonest with little things will also be dishonest with much more. If you have not handled worldly wealth honestly, who would trust you with true wealth? If you have not dealt with someone else's wealth honestly, why would somebody give you property for yourself? Did you pay attention? Jesus is talking about worldly and heavenly wealth. Even in the ungodly world, when someone is known to be dishonest, nobody wants to trust them. This is a truth we all know, and yet too many people say something like, nobody's going to find out. But in this study, we've already seen Jesus say something about that, like in Luke 12:2 and 3. He says, remember that everything people try to hide will be exposed. What you say in a quiet whisper will be repeated all over the village. But Jesus is not actually talking about the ungodly people here. He's asking why God should trust his people, you and me, with true wealth, spiritual wealth, heaven, if we do not use our worldly wealth to advance his kingdom. And then Jesus goes on. I guess that was the whole parable there. But Jesus goes on and says, no one can serve two masters in verse 13. You will either hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Now, no doubt you've heard this lesson before, but I want to take a very serious look at this. I've shared this story before, but one day I was meeting with a bunch of ministers, quite a few, 6 or 8. One of them asked what my travel plans were for the new year. We were just talking before our meeting started. And I explained that our church began praying about travel plans for a new year in November. Now remember, this was in January. And myself and my associate pastor started selecting events. We had just started that, and I told him that. Now another minister asked us what our traveling budget was. I thought about it for a moment and said that we didn't have a traveling budget. He asked how we knew what we could actually do. I explained that we made our traveling plans and that if we had enough money to go to the event, then we assumed God approved. If we didn't have enough money to go to that event, then we didn't go. And truthfully, not having enough money to attend an event not only happened once every 2 or 3 years. No, we spent a lot of time praying, and we sought God's wisdom. This was during the days of our motorcycle ministry. Now, a different minister commented, I noticed you said if you had enough money to go, but you didn't say go and come back. What do you do if you don't have enough money to come home again? Do you depend on honorariums and love offerings? I chuckled and said, no, most of the places we go are not Christian events or churches, although we do some of those as well. We just trust God to bring us home, and we have some almost unbelievable stories about how God provided. And I've shared some of those before. But here's the way I told him, here's the way we look at it. If we are stranded somewhere, the fields are white for harvest there too. Going back to quote one of Jesus' sayings. In the fall of that year, one of the ministers there came to me and to say our system didn't work. I wasn't sure what he was talking about until he told me that he had accepted a speaking engagement in another state and at a church, and hold on. He accepted the speaking engagement at a church in another state, and he said he had only taken enough money to get there, but not enough to get home. He told the church he did not want a love offering. I said the system must work. You are here. He said he used his credit card to get home. I sighed, and I said, you do not understand what it means to trust in God. You trust in your money. I do not carry a credit card, and unlike you, I do not own a vehicle the bank would give me a loan against. I also don't own a nice home like yours. I do have a credit card today. It's got a $1,000 limit. I still don't own a vehicle worth getting a loan. Nobody's going to give me a loan on it. And I don't own a house. And I told him, no doubt your wife could take out a second mortgage or a line of credit against your house because it was a nice house. I said, you are trusting in your wealth. I have no other option than to trust and depend on God. He walked away from me with a frown, and it's been maybe 15 years and he still hasn't spoken to me. Do you trust in God? That's what God wants from us. He wants us to be obedient. We can't serve God and be focused on our money. The two sins that the Bible talks about the most is the love of money, tithes, offerings, whatever, and sexual sins. Now, I'm going to just focus on the money right now. As many preachers remind us, there's only one passage in the Bible where God challenges us to trust Him with our money. In Malachi chapter 3, verses 6 through 12, a passage that many preachers have taught, and it's a great one. God says, I am the Lord, and I do not change. That's why you, Jacob's descendants, have not been destroyed. From the beginning of your nation, you have continually ignored my laws. If you reach out to me, I will reach out to you. You ask questions like, how should we reach out to you? And can mere humans rob God? However, you have stolen from me. So then you wonder how you have robbed me? You have robbed me of tithes and offerings. That is why your nation is cursed. Because you are still robbing from me. Bring your full tithe to the temple, so there will be food in my temple. Test me and see that if you do that, I will pour out so many blessings from heaven that you will not have room to store everything. I will prevent pests from destroying your crops, and I will make sure your vines do not drop their fruit before it is ripe. If you do this, every nation will call you blessed, because your land will be wonderful. Do you understand what Malachi wrote? Notice that God says he does not change. That's a strong indication, in my opinion, that his message is for his people, all his people throughout time. Do God's people today pay tithes and offerings beyond the tithes? Most Christians do not. We tend to try to justify this by saying Old Testament rules don't apply to us. But God says he does not change. Think about it. Do you want the full blessings of God? Obey his laws, all of them. That includes tithes and offerings and so much more. Don't think this is about money. This is about your heart. Well, verse 14 and 15, Jesus says, or Luke wrote this: the Pharisees loved money, and when they heard about what Jesus had said, their contempt for what he said was so obvious in how they smirked at him. Jesus looked at them and said, you like to make yourself look holy in front of the people, but God knows what's in your heart. What people think is valuable is of no value to God. Have you noticed how important it is to most Christians that they attend a large church with fancy shows for praise and worship, with multimedia included during sermons? Have you noticed how important it is for the ministers in those churches to have fancy cars and fancy houses and jets and expensive vacations? Those are probably not what God considers important. But that's maybe just my opinion. What do you think? God seems to be more interested in people being obedient to his laws. Think about it. 1 Samuel 15:22. God said, I want obedience more than sacrifice. Oh, well, Jesus is going to continue basically saying the more things change, the more they stay the same. At least that's the way I read this. Verses 16 and 17. Until John the Baptist came, you taught the law and the prophets. He's talking to the Pharisees, remember. Since then, the good news regarding God's kingdom is being preached, and people are trying to enter his kingdom. Remember this: it is easier for heaven and earth to disappear than for a single letter to be erased from God's law. Malachi 3:6, I am God and I do not change. Well, God's law remains God's law. I mentioned that in Luke 5 and Luke 14. I'm reminded what Jesus said in Matthew 5:17. He said, I did not come to abolish the law and the prophets, I came to fulfill them. And in verse 18, he's going to give us an example. Now, we can take a whole lesson out of this one verse, but I want you to know it's an example. An example we should pay attention to, mind you. Verse 18, if a man divorces his wife and then marries another woman, he has committed adultery. If a man marries a woman who's been divorced, he has committed adultery. This is a topic brought up in the Bible many times, but divorce is so ingrained in our Christian lives today that nobody wants to do anything to say, it's not my fault. It was my spouse's fault. And then we just go on our way. We can justify it any way we want except by quoting the Bible. In Matthew 19:8, Jesus said Moses allowed divorce because of the hardness of your hearts. Okay, I'm not trying to teach about divorce here. I'm just saying that God's law does not change. That's why we say the Old Testament is the New Testament concealed. The New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. In Matthew 5, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus teaches us that when the Old Testament says, do not commit murder, Jesus says, I'm telling you that means don't even be angry. Jesus took the Old Testament law and applied it in a spiritual manner. God's law doesn't change. It's our understanding of it. when you're teaching a child, you start out with this simple principle, and then you gradually teach them the reasoning and the results and the effects. All right. I want to finish Luke 16 today. You've probably heard this parable before, but pay attention to see if you can learn anything new. For example, do you know why we are not given the beggar's name, but we are given the beggar's name, but not the wealthy man's name? I have no idea why, but it is a little detail that's easily overlooked. Just something I noticed. 19 through 21. There was a wealthy man who wore the finest of clothes and lived a life of luxury. Outside of his gated house was a beggar named Lazarus. The beggar dreamed about just getting some of the food the rich man threw away. His life was so miserable that dogs licked his sores. Have you ever paid attention to the little details, the insignificant things about how miserable Lazarus was, dreaming about eating the wealthy man's trash? Dumpster diving? There are people that live that way in America today. You probably think that's disgusting. And Lazarus had dogs licking his sores. Maybe he couldn't move. Maybe he just laid on a bed of sorts. We aren't told. Verse 22 to 24. One day the beggar died, and angels took him to sit next to Abraham. The wealthy man also died and was buried. The wealthy man was being tormented in hell, and he saw Abraham far away with Lazarus sitting next to him. He pleaded, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me and let Lazarus dip his finger into some water so he can cool my tongue, because I'm in terrible agony." No, this is not what heaven and hell are like. Revelation 21:4 tells us there's no sorrow in heaven. And if God's people saw the torment of hell, there would be sorrow in heaven, especially if someone we love was there. This is an illustration, people, a story intended to make a point, like many of Jesus' stories, parables. In verses 25 through 31, Abraham responded, "Son, do you remember that during your lifetime you had everything you could enjoy while Lazarus had nothing at all? Now he is comforted, but you are in agony. Beyond that, there's an enormous gulf between us, and no one can cross it." The wealthy man answered, "Father, I'm pleading with you to send Lazarus to my 5 brothers so he can warn them to avoid this place." Abraham replied, "They can pay attention to Moses and the prophets." The man said, "No, Father Abraham. They would repent only if someone came back from the dead." Abraham told him, "If they won't learn from Moses and the prophets, they will not be persuaded to change their lives, even if someone returns from the dead." Why wouldn't people believe if someone rose from the dead? Think about it. Well, for example, people who believe in evolution decide what they believe, and then in order to support their beliefs, they create their so-called facts. Then they have to continuously change their theories and make up more of their so-called facts in order to justify what they believe. They ignore the simple fact that something or someone existed. I'm not debating evolution versus creation here. I'm just saying that if you believe in evolution, then you are refusing to address that very simple fact. Something or someone existed. Now, if you believe in evolution, you have to ignore the vast complexities, incalculable numbers of different steps required to develop the universe and everything in it. They won't believe in creation regardless of what happens. They will assume someone coming back from the dead was not really dead, but just appeared dead. Don't you see that? No, I cannot prove God exists, but having faith in God is no different than having faith in that something existed. Evolution requires as much or more faith compared to believing in an eternal creator. That's what Jesus is talking about here. Have you learned that lesson? Have you learned to be obedient to God totally? Have you learned to trust in God totally? It's not too late. Seek Him with all your heart.